Picture this. Two sisters, 19 years old, walking home on a route they'd taken hundreds of times before. A quiet street in a small Missouri town where everyone knows everyone. A walk that should have taken 12 minutes. They call their parents to say they're on their way. And then, nothing. They vanish into the October night, as if the earth itself swallowed them whole. For 18 years, this cold case haunted Oak Bend, Missouri. A town of just 4,000 people, torn apart by whispers, accusations, and the unbearable weight of not knowing. Hundreds searched. Police followed every lead. The FBI got involved. But Jessica and Amanda Miller remained missing, their fate a mystery that seemed destined to stay unsolved forever. Until 2020, when a construction crew made a discovery that would crack this cold case wide open. What they found would lead investigators to a suspect so shocking, so unthinkable, that when the arrest finally came, it didn't just surprise the community. It shattered everything they thought they knew about trust, safety, and the person sitting in the front pew at the sisters' memorial service. This is the story of how one of Missouri's most baffling cold cases finally got solved, how modern forensic science gave voice to the voiceless, and how an arrest shocked an entire community to its core. This is the story of Jessica and Amanda Miller. Let me introduce you to Jessica Miller. 19 years old in the fall of 2002, with shoulder-length blonde hair that she always wore in a ponytail when she worked. Friends described her as the kind of person who lit up every room she entered. Bubbly, they said, always smiling, always making others feel welcome. Jessica had dreams of becoming an elementary school teacher, and anyone who knew her could already see it. She was a natural with kids, patient and kind, the type of person who remembered everyone's birthday and always had an encouraging word. And then there was Amanda, Jessica's twin sister, though you'd never guess it from their personalities. Where Jessica was outgoing and effervescent, Amanda was quieter, more introspective. She was the artist of the family, always sketching in a worn leather notebook she carried everywhere. Her talent was undeniable. She'd won multiple regional art competitions, and her watercolor landscapes hung in the Oak Bend Public Library. Amanda dreamed of attending the Kansas City Art Institute, though she worried about the cost and leaving her family behind. Despite their different personalities, the Miller sisters were inseparable. They'd been that way since childhood, two halves of a whole. They shared a bedroom in their parents' modest ranch house on Maple Street. They worked the same shifts at the Townside Diner, Oak Bend's local gathering spot where everyone came for breakfast on Sundays. They were saving money together for a cross-country road trip they'd been planning since sophomore year of high school. A journey to see the Pacific Ocean, something neither of them had ever experienced. Their father, Robert Miller, worked at the county maintenance department. He'd coached both girls in softball when they were younger, and he still had all their trophies displayed on a shelf in the garage. Their mother, Patricia, worked part-time at the Oak Bend Elementary School as a teaching aide. The Millers were what you'd call a typical American family. Hardworking, close-knit, involved in their church, known throughout the community. Jessica had a boyfriend, Tyler Stevens, who worked at his father's auto repair shop. They'd been dating for 2 years and talked about getting engaged after he saved enough for a ring. Amanda had recently started seeing someone too, a quiet guy named Marcus who worked at the library and shared her love of art. Life was good. Life was full of promise. The future stretched out before these two young women, bright and inviting. On Saturday evenings, the sisters worked the dinner shift at the Townside Diner together. It was routine, predictable, safe. They'd clock out at 9, walk the half-mile home along well-lit streets, and usually be tucked into their beds by 10 o'clock. Their parents never worried. Oak Bend wasn't the kind of place where things happened. It was the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked, where children rode bikes until the streetlights came on, where the biggest news was usually about the high school football team's latest game. October 12, 2002, started like any other Saturday for Jessica and Amanda Miller. They woke up early, helped their mother with some household chores, and arrived at the Townside Diner at 3 in the afternoon for their shift. Regular customers remember seeing them that evening. Jessica served coffee and her famous smile to the Henderson family. Amanda took orders from the corner booth where the Rotary Club members always sat. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. But October 12, 2002, would be the last day anyone ever saw Jessica and Amanda Miller alive. The dinner rush at the Townside Diner wound down around 8:30 that Saturday evening. Jessica and Amanda began their closing duties, wiping down tables, refilling sugar dispensers, counting out their tips. The owner, Margaret Chun, remembers saying goodnight to them at approximately 8:55. She locked the front door behind them and watched through the window as they headed east on Main Street toward home, as they always did. At exactly 9:03 p.m., Patricia Miller's phone rang. It was Jessica, calling from her Nokia cell phone. The conversation was brief and unremarkable. "Hey Mom, we just left work. We'll be home in about 15 minutes. Amanda wants to know if there's any of that apple pie left from dinner." Patricia laughed, told them yes, and said she'd warm up 2 slices. The call lasted 47 seconds. It would be the last time Patricia Miller heard her daughter's voice. The route from the Townside Diner to the Miller home was straightforward and safe. Half a mile total. East on Main Street for 3 blocks, then a left turn onto Maple Street, and the Miller house was 4 houses down on the right. Streetlights illuminated the entire route. It was a walk the sisters had made hundreds of times, in all kinds of weather, at all times of day and night. The route passed by familiar landmarks: the Oak Bend Methodist Church, the Piggly Wiggly grocery store, the post office, the elementary school where their mother worked. 9:15 came and went. Patricia wasn't concerned. Maybe the girls had stopped to chat with someone. Oak Bend was that kind of town you couldn't walk 2 blocks without running into someone you knew. 9:30. Still no sign of them. Patricia looked out the front window, peering down Maple Street into the October darkness. 9:45. Now she was worried. She called Jessica's cell phone. It rang once and went straight to voicemail. Robert Miller got in his pickup truck and drove the route backward from their house to the diner. Nothing. No sign of his daughters anywhere along the way. He pulled into the Townside Diner parking lot, empty except for Margaret Chen's car. He drove slowly down the back alleys, the side streets, anywhere they might have detoured. Nothing. At 10:15, Robert Miller called the Oak Bend Police Department to report his daughters missing. Officer Dale Simmons took the call. In a small town like Oak Bend, where the police department consisted of exactly 7 officers, a missing persons report for 2 well-known young women was taken very seriously. Simmons immediately contacted Police Chief Bernard Hayes, who lived just 6 blocks from the station. Within 20 minutes, every available officer was searching the streets of Oak Bend. They retraced the route from the diner. They knocked on doors. They called for the sisters by name. They checked the elementary school playground, the parking lots, behind the shops along Main Street. At 11:30 p.m., they found something. Jessica's cell phone, lying in the grass at the corner of Main Street and Oak Avenue, approximately 2 blocks from the diner. The phone's battery was dead. There were no signs of a struggle, no other belongings, just the phone, sitting there in the grass as if someone had simply dropped it while walking. This discovery changed everything. What had been a missing persons case now felt like something far more sinister. Chief Hayes called in reinforcements from the surrounding counties. By midnight, 50 officers were searching Oak Bend and the surrounding areas. By dawn on Sunday, October 13th, that number had swelled to 200, including volunteers from the community, neighbors, teachers, coaches, church members. Everyone who knew the Miller sisters wanted to help bring them home. Search teams fanned out in every direction from where the phone was found. They searched the woods behind the elementary school, the banks of Little Creek that ran along the eastern edge of town, the abandoned grain silos on Route 54. Bloodhounds were brought in, given the scent from the sisters' bedroom. The dogs tracked the scent from the diner, along Main Street, and then seemed to lose it completely at the corner where Jessica's phone was found. It was as if the sisters had simply vanished into thin air at that exact spot. Patricia and Robert Miller stood in their front yard that Sunday morning, watching the search unfold, their faces masks of anguish and disbelief. How could this happen? How could their daughters disappear from a well-lit street in a safe town? Jessica's boyfriend Tyler joined the search, his eyes red from crying. Amanda's library friend Marcus walked the creek banks, calling their names until his voice grew hoarse. The entire town of Oak Bend mobilized, united in fear and determination. But as Sunday turned into Monday, and Monday into Tuesday, the harsh reality began to set in. Despite hundreds of searchers, despite countless hours of effort, despite the involvement of the FBI and the Missouri State Highway Patrol, there was no trace of Jessica and Amanda Miller beyond that cell phone in the grass. No witnesses had seen anything unusual. No vehicles had been reported acting suspiciously. No one had heard screams or calls for help. The sisters had simply vanished, and the town of Oak Bend was left with a terrifying question. What happened to Jessica and Amanda Miller on that quiet October night? Detective Marcus Brennan of the Missouri State Highway Patrol took lead on the investigation. A 30-year veteran with experience in major crimes, Brennan arrived in Oak Bend on Monday, October 14th, and immediately set up a command center at the police station. He'd worked missing persons cases before, and he knew the first 72 hours were critical. But he also knew that this case had characteristics that troubled him deeply. The location where Jessica's phone was found became the focal point of the investigation. The corner of Main Street and Oak Avenue sat directly in front of the Oak Bend Methodist Church, one of the most visible locations in town. Street lights illuminated the area. The church had motion sensor lights that would activate with any movement. Several houses had windows facing that intersection. And yet, not a single person reported seeing or hearing anything unusual between 9:03, when the sisters left the diner, and 9:45, when their mother began to worry. Detective Brennan's team conducted extensive interviews. They spoke with every single person who'd been at the Townside Diner that evening. They questioned everyone who lived or worked along the route between the diner and the Miller home. They interviewed the sisters' friends, classmates, co-workers, and family members. They built a timeline of the sisters' last known movements down to the minute. The diner's closing time, 8:55 p.m. The phone call to their mother, 9:03 p.m. The estimated walking time from the diner to where the phone was found, approximately 4 to 5 minutes. This meant the sisters were likely at that corner between 9:07 and 9:10 p.m. A window of just 3 minutes. Something had happened in those 3 minutes that changed everything. Early theories emerged. Was this a random abduction? Had someone been watching the sisters, waiting for an opportunity? Was this premeditated or opportunistic? Detective Brennan considered every possibility. He looked at transient workers. There was a construction crew working on Route 54 that week, outsiders who didn't know the area. He examined sex offenders registered in the county. He investigated whether the sisters had any enemies, anyone who might wish them harm. One lead that consumed significant resources was the theory of a targeted abduction. Detectives discovered that Amanda had received several anonymous notes at the diner over the previous month. The notes were innocuous but slightly odd. Compliments on her appearance, comments about her artwork. She'd mentioned them to Jessica but hadn't been particularly concerned. The notes had been thrown away, so there was no way to analyze them. Could someone have been obsessing over Amanda? Could this have been a stalker who finally acted on dark impulses? The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit profiled the likely perpetrator. They suggested someone with local knowledge, someone familiar with the sisters' routines, someone who knew exactly when and where they'd be vulnerable. They noted the lack of physical evidence suggested either extraordinary luck or careful planning. The profile described a likely male, age 25 to 45, possibly with previous criminal behavior, someone who might appear normal and non-threatening to the victims. But as days turned into weeks, every promising lead evaporated into nothing. The construction workers all had solid alibis. The registered sex offenders were accounted for. Friends and family passed polygraph tests. Tyler, Jessica's boyfriend, was devastated and cooperative, with a documented alibi. He'd been at his parents' house watching a baseball game with his father and 2 brothers. Marcus, Amanda's friend from the library, had been working the closing shift that night, verified by multiple witnesses and timestamp data from the library's computer system. Detective Brennan expanded the search area. Teams combed through hundreds of acres of farmland, wooded areas, and rural properties surrounding Oak Bend. They dragged Little Creek and the larger Pine River 10 miles to the east. They searched abandoned buildings, barns, and storage facilities. They flew helicopter surveillance over the region. The Missouri State Highway Patrol dedicated unprecedented resources to this case. And they found nothing. Not a single shred of physical evidence beyond that cell phone. The Miller family held a press conference 2 weeks after the disappearance. Patricia Miller, barely holding herself together, made a tearful plea. Please, if someone has our girls, please let them come home. They're loved. They're missed. We just want them back. No questions asked. Just bring them home. Robert Miller sat beside his wife, his face a mask of barely contained rage and helplessness. The press conference was broadcast on local and regional news. It generated hundreds of tips. Every single one led nowhere. The Oak Bend Methodist Church held a prayer vigil 3 weeks after the disappearance. More than 800 people attended, overflowing the church sanctuary. Pastor Richard Coleman led the prayers. Friends spoke about the sisters, their kindness, their dreams, their impact on the community. Among those attending was Gerald Peterson, the church deacon and retired quarry foreman. He sat in his usual front pew, his wife Margaret beside him, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief. He'd been one of the first volunteers in the initial search, organizing teams and providing maps of the surrounding areas from his knowledge of local geography. Gerald Peterson. Remember that name. We'll be coming back to it. By December 2002, the investigation had stalled. Detective Brennan had exhausted every conventional avenue. He'd interviewed hundreds of people, followed thousands of tips, coordinated with multiple agencies. But the cold reality was undeniable. Without physical evidence, without witnesses, without any trace of the sisters beyond that phone, the case was going cold. Brennan promised the Miller family he wouldn't give up, that he'd keep working the case, but privately, he knew the odds of finding Jessica and Amanda alive were diminishing with each passing day. The case file was officially classified as a cold case in March 2003, 6 months after the disappearance. It wasn't closed. Technically, it remained an active investigation, but the dedicated task force was disbanded. Detective Brennan returned to his regular duties, though he kept the Miller file on his desk, reviewing it during slow moments, hoping something would click. The FBI maintained the sisters' information in their national database. But realistically, without new evidence or a witness coming forward, the case was frozen in time. For the Miller family and the town of Oak Bend, the lack of answers was almost worse than the worst news. At least closure, however painful, provides a finality. But this was an open wound that wouldn't heal, a question mark that hung over every conversation, every gathering, every moment. What happened to Jessica and Amanda Miller? Time moves forward, even when it feels like it shouldn't. The calendar pages turned from 2003 to 2004, from 2004 to 2005. Life in Oak Bend continued, but it was forever changed. The easy trust that had defined this small town evaporated. Parents drove their children everywhere instead of letting them walk. Women no longer ventured out alone after dark. The sense of safety that had been Oak Bend's defining characteristic was gone, replaced by an undercurrent of fear and suspicion. Patricia Miller's hair turned gray within a year of her daughter's disappearance. She quit her job at the elementary school. Being around children the same age as her missing daughters was too painful. She threw herself into advocacy work, connecting with other families of missing persons, attending conferences, lobbying for legislation to improve how law enforcement handles missing persons cases. It was the only thing that gave her purpose, the only thing that made her feel like she was doing something, anything to help. Robert Miller aged a decade in those first few years. He maintained the sisters' bedroom exactly as they'd left it. Jessica's softball trophies on the dresser, Amanda's art supplies arranged on her desk, their clothing still hanging in the shared closet. He visited the corner of Main Street and Oak Avenue every single Sunday morning, standing at the spot where Jessica's phone was found, as if proximity to that location might somehow provide answers. Neighbors worried about him. Some whispered about grief counseling, about medication, about the toll that not knowing was taking on his mental health. The Millers held annual vigils every October 12th. The first anniversary drew nearly 1,000 people. The second anniversary, maybe 600. By the fifth anniversary, attendance had dwindled to fewer than 200. Mostly family, close friends, and a core group of dedicated community members who refused to let the memory of Jessica and Amanda fade. It's a harsh truth, but public attention has a shelf life. Cold cases that don't get solved eventually become old news, and the communal focus shifts to more immediate concerns. The town itself developed an uncomfortable relationship with the disappearance. Some people believed the sisters were still alive somewhere, perhaps amnesia victims or being held against their will. Others believed they'd been murdered, but their bodies would never be found. A disturbing faction whispered about the sisters themselves. Maybe they'd run away, staged their own disappearance, started new lives elsewhere. These whispers hurt the Miller family almost as much as the loss itself. How dare anyone suggest Jessica and Amanda had chosen to abandon their family? Various theories circulated through Oak Bend like an underground current. Some suspected the boyfriend, Tyler, despite his airtight alibi. The boyfriend always did it, people muttered, ignoring the facts. Others pointed fingers at transient workers, at strangers passing through on Highway 54. There were whispers about organized crime, about human trafficking networks, about satanic cults. The wild speculation that emerges when facts are absent and fear fills the void. Detective Brennan never let the case rest entirely. Every few months, he'd revisit the file, re-interview key witnesses, see if anyone's story had changed or if new information had emerged. In 2007, there was a brief spark of hope when a woman in Arkansas claimed to have seen two young women matching Jessica and Amanda's description working at a truck stop. Investigators rushed to check it out. The women turned out to be unrelated individuals who merely resembled the Miller sisters. Another dead end in a long series of disappointments. As forensic technology advanced, Detective Brennan had the cell phone re-examined multiple times. In 2010, new software allowed technicians to extract additional data from the phone's memory. They found text messages, call logs, and even a few photos. The information provided more detail about the sisters' final hours but offered no clues about their disappearance. The last text message Amanda had sent was to Marcus. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Movie at 7. It was heartbreaking in its normalcy. Other cold cases sometimes get solved because witnesses develop a conscience or because deathbed confessions provide closure. The Miller family clung to this hope. Surely someone knew something. Surely whoever took their daughters would eventually be caught for another crime, or would confess, or would make a mistake. But year after year passed with no such breakthrough. 2008, 2010, 2012, 2015. The cold case remained cold. Tyler Stevens, Jessica's boyfriend, eventually married someone else, though friends said he never fully recovered from the loss. He named his first daughter Jessica, in honor of the woman he'd planned to marry. Marcus left Oak Bend after college, unable to shake the memories and the constant reminders. The Townside Diner changed ownership in 2014. The new owners removed the memorial plaque for Jessica and Amanda that Margaret Chin had installed, claiming it was bad for business. The outcry from the community forced them to reinstate it, but the damage to community cohesion was done. Margaret Peterson, wife of church deacon Gerald Peterson, developed health problems in the mid-2010s. Gerald had retired from the quarry in 2001, just a year before the sisters disappeared, and spent his retirement years doing church work, volunteering with local youth programs, and maintaining their modest home on Sunset Drive. To outsiders, the Petersons appeared to be a stable, religious couple, the kind of people you'd trust with your house keys or your children. But appearances, as we're about to discover, can be devastatingly deceiving. Gerald Peterson had attended every anniversary vigil for Jessica and Amanda. He'd helped organize search parties back in 2002. He'd comforted the Miller family at church. He'd stood in that sanctuary, singing hymns and praying for the sisters' safe return. And all the while, according to what investigators would later discover, he was hiding the darkest of secrets. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because for 18 long years, from October 2002 to the fall of 2020, The fate of Jessica and Amanda Miller remained one of Missouri's most baffling unsolved mysteries. The cold case file sat in storage, reviewed occasionally but essentially dormant. The town of Oak Bend learned to live with the unanswered questions. The Miller family learned to function while carrying an unbearable weight. And then, on a routine construction site in October 2020, exactly 18 years after the sisters vanished, a discovery was made that would change everything. A discovery that would finally give voice to the silent victims. A discovery that would lead investigators straight to a killer who'd been hiding in plain sight for nearly 2 decades. October 2020. A development company called Riverside Properties had purchased 70 acres of land on the outskirts of Oak Bend, planning to build a new subdivision of affordable housing. The land included the old Rockcrest quarry, which had been abandoned since 2001 when the limestone deposits were depleted and operations ceased. The quarry itself was considered too dangerous to build on, sheer rock faces and deep water-filled pits, but the surrounding property was prime for development. The construction crew began preliminary surveying on October 6, 2020. Heavy equipment cleared overgrown vegetation. Surveyors marked boundaries. Environmental specialists tested soil samples. It was routine work, the kind of thing that happens at construction sites across America every single day. The crew foreman was a man named Danny Rodriguez, a 35-year veteran of the construction industry who'd seen just about everything. But he'd never seen anything like what they discovered on October 9th. An excavator operator named James Mitchell was clearing brush near the northeastern corner of the property, about 200 yards from the old quarry entrance. The excavator's bucket snagged on something beneath the soil. Mitchell assumed it was a root system or buried debris. He maneuvered the bucket, trying to work around the obstruction. The bucket pulled up a clump of dirt and something else. Something that made Mitchell immediately shut down his equipment and call for the foreman. Danny Rodriguez approached the excavator, asking what the problem was. Mitchell pointed to the ground where the bucket had disturbed the soil. There, partially exposed, was what appeared to be bone. Human bone. Rodriguez, who'd found historical remains on other sites before, immediately secured the area and called the local authorities. The Oak Bend Police Department arrived within 15 minutes. Chief Bernard Hayes, now 63 years old and still heading the small police force, recognized the potential significance immediately. He contacted the Missouri State Highway Patrol and requested forensic anthropology support. By early afternoon, the site was classified as a potential crime scene. Yellow tape cordoned off a 50-foot radius around the discovery. A team of specialists from the state medical examiner's office arrived the following morning. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Sarah Hendricks supervised the excavation personally. This wasn't a job for heavy equipment. This required delicate hand tools, brushes, and meticulous documentation. Her team worked carefully, removing soil layer by layer, photographing and cataloging everything. What they uncovered over the next 3 days would finally answer the question that had haunted Oak Bend for 18 years. 2 skeletons, positioned side by side in a shallow grave approximately 4 feet below the surface. The remains were in remarkably good condition given the time elapsed. The soil composition, high clay content, had created a relatively stable environment that slowed decomposition. But more importantly, there were items with the remains. Items that would prove crucial to identification. Tattered fragments of blue fabric, the unmistakable color of the Townside Diner uniforms. Decayed remnants of denim jeans. 2 pairs of white tennis shoes, the brand still visible on the deteriorated rubber. And then, the item that made the investigators' hearts skip. A silver locket, tarnished but intact, with an engraved inscription on the back. To Jessica, love Mom and Dad, graduation 2002. They'd found Jessica and Amanda Miller. Chief Hayes had the heartbreaking duty of informing Patricia and Robert Miller. 18 years of not knowing, of hoping against hope that maybe, somehow, their daughters were still alive somewhere. And now, confirmation of what they'd feared but never wanted to accept. Patricia collapsed when she heard the news. Robert simply stared, his face expressionless, as if his capacity for emotion had finally been exhausted. The remains were transported to the state medical examiner's facility in Jefferson City. Dr. Hendricks oversaw the forensic analysis personally. DNA extraction from the bone marrow confirmed what the locket had already suggested. These were indeed Jessica and Amanda Miller. Dental records provided additional confirmation. After 18 years, the sisters were finally coming home. But identification was only the beginning. The real questions were how and why. Dr. Hendricks's examination revealed critical information about cause of death. Both victims showed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull. The injuries were consistent with being struck by a heavy object, possibly a metal tool or weapon. The trauma patterns suggested the blows came from behind, indicating the victims likely didn't see their attacker. Death would have been relatively quick, a small mercy in a case filled with horror. The location of the grave provided crucial information. The northeastern corner of the quarry property was remote and heavily wooded, accessible only by a dirt maintenance road that connected to State Route 54. In 2002, this area would have been even more isolated. The quarry had closed in 2001, meaning there were no workers around, no reason for anyone to be in that area. Whoever buried Jessica and Amanda here knew the property well enough to know it would be a secure hiding place. And that led investigators to ask a critical question. Who had intimate knowledge of the Rockcrest quarry property? Detective Marcus Brennan, now retired but immediately brought back as a consultant on the case, stood at the grave site and felt pieces clicking into place. He'd worked this case for years, had interviewed hundreds of people, had followed countless dead ends. But he'd never considered the quarry property. Why would he? The quarry had closed a year before the sisters disappeared. There'd been no reason to search there in 2002. The initial search efforts had focused on areas near where the cell phone was found, along potential routes an abductor might have taken from that location. But now, with the discovery of the grave, a new investigation began. Not just a search for who killed Jessica and Amanda Miller, but a forensic examination of every piece of physical evidence that might have survived 18 years underground. The crime scene team worked meticulously, sifting through every ounce of soil from the grave site, looking for anything that might identify the killer. And they found something. Something small, something that might have been overlooked by less thorough investigators. Something that would crack this cold case wide open and lead them straight to the killer. The soil samples from the grave site were sent to the Missouri State Crime Laboratory for analysis. Forensic technicians examined everything under high-powered microscopes: dirt particles, fabric fragments, trace materials. What they discovered was unexpected and ultimately damning. On the remnants of both victims' diner uniforms, forensic chemists found traces of an unusual substance, a specific type of industrial gear oil. This wasn't the common lubricant you'd find at any auto parts store. This was a specialized formulation, a heavy-duty industrial product manufactured by a company called Midwest Industrial Lubricants. The specific product, identified through chemical analysis as MILGO 470, had a very narrow distribution and specialized applications. Investigator Sarah Chun, a forensic scientist who joined the case, did something brilliant. She traced the manufacturing and distribution history of MILGO 470. She discovered that this particular gear oil had only been manufactured between 1995 and 2003, when the formula was changed and the product rebranded. The primary customers for this specific oil in Missouri? Quarry operations that used older model Caterpillar excavation equipment. The oil was specifically designed for the hydraulic systems and gear mechanisms in heavy quarry machinery manufactured in the 1980s and early 1990s. The Rockcrest quarry had used exclusively Caterpillar equipment, and MILGO 470 had been their primary lubricant for machinery maintenance. This discovery shifted the entire investigation. Detective Brennan, working with a newly assembled cold case task force, obtained employment records from the Rockcrest quarry. Between 1985 and 2001, when the quarry closed, approximately 47 people had worked there in various capacities. By 2020, some had died, some had moved away, but many still lived in or near Oak Bend. The task force began systematically investigating every former quarry employee. They were looking for someone with specific characteristics: intimate knowledge of the property, access to MILGO 470 gear oil, opportunity on the night of October 12, 2002, and some connection to the Miller sisters or the area where they disappeared. They cross-referenced employment records with the original investigation files from 2002, looking for anyone who'd been interviewed back then. One name kept appearing in the records: Gerald Peterson, 68 years old in 2020. He'd worked at the Rockcrest Quarry from 1985 until it closed in 2001, serving as the maintenance foreman for the last 10 years of operation. His job had involved maintaining all the heavy equipment, which meant regular access to gear oils, lubricants, and specialized tools. He knew every inch of that property, including the remote northeastern section where the grave was located. But Gerald Peterson wasn't just any former quarry worker. He was a pillar of the Oak Bend community, a church deacon, a man who'd helped search for the Miller sisters, a man who'd attended their vigils and comforted their family, a man who seemed beyond suspicion. Detective Brennan pulled the original investigation files and found something interesting. Gerald Peterson had been interviewed in October 2002 as part of the general canvassing of the community. The interview notes were brief. Peterson states he was home with his wife Margaret on the evening of October 12th. No useful information, no connection to victims. His wife had corroborated his alibi. The interview had lasted maybe 15 minutes. Peterson had been eliminated as a person of interest immediately because there was no apparent motive and he had a solid alibi. But 18 years later, with new evidence and fresh eyes, the task force decided to take another look at Gerald Peterson. They began with surveillance, watching his daily routines, documenting his activities. Peterson, retired and in his late 60s, lived a quiet life. He attended church on Sundays, volunteered at the food bank on Wednesdays, maintained his home, and spent most evenings reading or watching television. He seemed like exactly what he appeared to be, a harmless retiree. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret Peterson, Gerald's wife of 43 years, had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia in 2019. Her memory was declining, and her adult daughter, Linda, had become increasingly involved in her parents' care. In early November 2020, while helping her mother organize some belongings, Linda discovered something hidden in the back of her mother's closet. A series of journals that Margaret had kept privately for decades. Linda began reading the journals, initially just out of curiosity about her mother's inner thoughts. What she found horrified her. Years of documented domestic abuse, incidents of violence, threats, controlling behavior. Gerald Peterson, the respectable church deacon, had been a monster behind closed doors. Margaret had documented it all but had never told anyone. Trapped by fear, by religious beliefs about marriage, by the times she'd grown up in. And then Linda found the entry dated October 12, 2002. She read it once, didn't believe what she was seeing, and read it again. Her hands shook as she realized what she was holding. Evidence that her father's alibi, the alibi that had eliminated him from suspicion 18 years ago, was a lie. The entry read, "Gerald didn't come home tonight until after midnight. He left right after dinner around 7:30, said he had to check on something at the old quarry property. He was upset about something, angry. When he came home, his clothes were dirty, covered in dust and mud. His hands were shaking. He showered immediately and threw his clothes in the trash outside. He told me if anyone asked, I was to say he'd been home all evening. He scared me. I said I would. God forgive me. I said I would." Linda Peterson called the Missouri State Highway Patrol the next day. The task force received Margaret Peterson's journals with a mixture of excitement and heartbreak. Here, finally, was a crack in the wall of silence that had protected a killer for 18 years. But they needed more than a journal entry from a woman with dementia whose credibility could be challenged in court. They needed physical evidence. They needed forensic proof that would stand up to legal scrutiny. Detective Brennan, armed with this new information, obtained a search warrant for the Peterson residence. On November 12, 2020, investigators executed the warrant. Gerald Peterson answered the door, cooperative and confused, insisting there must be some mistake. He had nothing to hide, he said. They were welcome to search anywhere they wanted. They started with the garage. Gerald Peterson's garage was immaculately organized. Tools hung on pegboards, storage bins labeled and stacked, a pristine workbench against one wall. His truck, a 1998 Ford F-150 that he'd maintained meticulously, sat in the center bay. Investigators photographed everything, documenting the space before beginning their search. And then they started opening storage containers. In a metal box labeled hardware, hidden beneath packages of screws and nuts and bolts, they found a small plastic bag. Inside the bag were items that seemed out of place in a garage filled with tools and automotive supplies. A purple hair scrunchie, faded but recognizable. A silver class ring with an artistic design and the inscription OBHS 2002, Oak Bend High School. Amanda Miller's class ring. Gerald Peterson's demeanor changed instantly when he saw what investigators had found. His face paled. His cooperative attitude evaporated. "I want a lawyer," he said. Those would be the last words he'd voluntarily speak to police for the next several weeks. But the evidence was just beginning to pile up. The forensic team moved to the Ford F-150. The truck appeared clean, well-maintained, with no obvious signs of having been involved in a crime 18 years earlier. But forensic technology in 2020 was far more sophisticated than in 2002. The team used luminol, a chemical that reveals blood traces even after extensive cleaning and years of time. When they sprayed the truck bed with luminol and turned off the lights, the result was stunning. The entire bed of the truck glowed with the distinctive blue fluorescence that indicates blood presence. Even after 18 years, even after countless cleanings, the hemoglobin in blood reacted with the luminol. Someone had bled extensively in that truck bed. The pattern suggested two separate pooling areas, consistent with two victims. DNA analysis would take several weeks, but when the results came back, they confirmed what investigators already suspected. The blood traces matched Jessica and Amanda Miller's DNA profiles, obtained from their parents for comparison during the original investigation. The evidence was overwhelming. The gear oil on the victim's clothing matched the industrial lubricant used at the quarry where Peterson worked. The grave location was on property Peterson knew intimately. Personal items belonging to the victims were hidden in Peterson's garage. Blood evidence in his truck matched the victim's DNA. And his alibi for the night of the murders, provided by his wife, was demonstrably false according to her own journal entries. Investigators reconstructed what likely happened on October 12, 2002. Gerald Peterson, driving his Ford F-150, had encountered Jessica and Amanda Miller walking home from work. The corner of Main and Oak Avenue was just 3 blocks from Peterson's own home. He likely offered them a ride. A trusted family friend. A church deacon. Someone the sisters would have had no reason to fear. They accepted, perhaps grateful not to walk the remaining blocks in the October chill. But instead of driving them home, Peterson drove to the abandoned quarry property, 2 miles outside town on a route he knew wouldn't have traffic at that time of night. What happened at the quarry remains partially unclear. Peterson has never confessed, never explained his actions. The forensic evidence suggests the sisters were struck from behind with a heavy object, likely a metal tool from the quarry maintenance shed. The blows killed them quickly. Peterson buried them in a location he knew would be undisturbed. The quarry had closed a year earlier. The property was owned by a corporation in Kansas City that had no immediate plans for the land. It was the perfect hiding place. He kept items belonging to the sisters, trophies of his crime, a common behavior among certain types of killers. He went home, showered, disposed of his clothing, and told his wife to lie for him if anyone asked questions. And for 18 years his secret held. He lived his life as if nothing had happened. He attended their vigils. He comforted their family. He stood in church and sang hymns while knowing exactly where Jessica and Amanda Miller were buried. The task force compiled their evidence into a comprehensive case file. They consulted with the district attorney's office. The evidence was circumstantial, no witnesses, no confession, no direct observation of the crime. But the circumstantial evidence was strong, multiple independent pieces that all pointed to the same conclusion. Gerald Peterson had murdered Jessica and Amanda Miller. On November 15, 2020, arrest warrants were issued for Gerald Peterson on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The task force prepared to take him into custody. After 18 years, Justice was finally coming for the man who'd stolen 2 young lives and devastated an entire community. The morning of November 17, 2020, dawned cold and overcast over Oak Bend, Missouri. At exactly 7 a.m., a convoy of 6 police vehicles assembled at the Highway Patrol Barracks on the outskirts of town. Detective Brennan, now 70 years old but determined to see this case through to its conclusion, addressed the team. This wasn't just another arrest. This was the culmination of an 18-year nightmare. This was justice for Jessica and Amanda Miller. The convoy arrived at 324 Sunset Drive at 7:15 a.m. Gerald Peterson's modest ranch home sat on a quiet street, surrounded by well-maintained lawns and similar middle-class residences. Neighbors were just beginning their morning routines, starting coffee, preparing for work, getting children ready for school. None of them had any idea that the respected church deacon living 3 doors down was about to be arrested for a double murder that had haunted their town for nearly 2 decades. Detective Brennan, accompanied by 6 other officers, approached the front door. They knocked, announced their presence, and waited. Margaret Peterson answered, confusion evident on her face. Her daughter Linda stood behind her, having stayed with her parents since coming forward with the journals. "We have a warrant for Gerald Peterson's arrest," Brennan stated, his voice calm but firm. Gerald Peterson appeared in the hallway, dressed in pajamas and a bathrobe. He looked older than his 68 years at that moment, his face drawn, his shoulders slumped. He knew why they were there. He'd known this moment was coming since the day they'd searched his garage and found what he'd hidden for so long. The arrest was conducted without incident. Peterson was handcuffed, read his Miranda rights, and escorted to a waiting patrol car. As he walked down his driveway, neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the police presence. Whispers spread rapidly. "That's Gerald Peterson. What's happening? Why are they arresting him?" The confusion was palpable. This was Gerald Peterson, church deacon, respected community member, the man who'd helped search for the Miller sisters. Within an hour, news of the arrest spread through Oak Bend like wildfire. The local radio station interrupted regular programming with a special bulletin. The Kansas City television stations dispatched news crews. Social media exploded with speculation and shock. Gerald Peterson had been arrested for the murders of Jessica and Amanda Miller. The cold case that had defined Oak Bend for 18 years had finally been solved. At the Miller residence on Maple Street, Detective Brennan personally delivered the news to Patricia and Robert. He sat in their living room, the same living room where he'd first interviewed them in October 2002, when hope was still alive that the sisters might be found safe. Patricia listened to the details of the arrest, tears streaming down her face. Robert sat silently, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair until his knuckles turned white. "Gerald Peterson?" Patricia finally whispered. "But he helped search for them. He prayed with us. Her voice trailed off as the full horror of the betrayal sank in. The man who'd stood beside them at vigils, who'd offered comfort and support, who'd been trusted as a pillar of the community. That man had murdered their daughters and lied to their faces for 18 years. The trauma of learning a killer's identity can sometimes be worse than not knowing at all. At least an unknown perpetrator can be imagined as a monster, someone outside the circle of normal life. But Gerald Peterson had been inside that circle. He'd been part of their community, part of their church, someone they'd known and trusted. The betrayal was almost as devastating as the murders themselves. The Oak Bend Methodist Church held an emergency meeting that evening. Pastor Richard Coleman, who'd served the congregation for 25 years, addressed the confused and devastated members. Gerald Peterson had been a deacon for 15 years. He'd led prayer groups, taught Sunday school, organized community outreach programs. How could this man have committed such evil? Psychologists who study criminal behavior have a term for this: the mask of sanity. Some individuals are capable of presenting a completely normal, even exemplary public face while hiding monstrous behavior. They function in society without obvious red flags. They can be charming, helpful, community-minded. The disconnect between their public persona and their private actions can be so complete that even people who've known them for decades are shocked when the truth emerges. Gerald Peterson was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder on November 18, 2020. The charges included special circumstances that could potentially make him eligible for the death penalty: multiple murders, killing in the commission of another felony, and the especially heinous nature of the crimes. The district attorney held a press conference announcing the charges, outlining the evidence in general terms, while avoiding specifics that might compromise the upcoming trial. Peterson was held without bail, deemed a potential flight risk and a danger to the community. His first court appearance was brief. He pleaded not guilty through his attorney, a public defender assigned when Peterson claimed he couldn't afford private counsel. The not guilty plea surprised no one. Without a confession, the case would proceed to trial, where the circumstantial evidence would be presented to a jury. For the first time in 18 years, Patricia and Robert Miller felt something they'd almost forgotten: hope. Not hope that their daughters would come home. That dream had died with the discovery of the grave. But hope that justice might finally be served, that the person responsible might be held accountable, that the truth would be publicly acknowledged in a court of law. The state of Missouri versus Gerald Peterson began on April 5, 2021, in the Randolph County Courthouse. Jury selection took 3 days. Finding impartial jurors in a county where everyone knew about the case proved challenging. Eventually, a jury of 12 was seated, along with 2 alternates. 7 women, 5 men, ranging in age from 28 to 67. These 12 people would decide Gerald Peterson's fate. The prosecution team was led by District Attorney Michael Thornton, a career prosecutor with 30 years of experience. He knew this case would be difficult. Circumstantial evidence, no witnesses, no confession. Everything would depend on connecting the dots for the jury, making them see that the individual pieces of evidence, when viewed together, pointed to only one conclusion: Gerald Peterson was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense was headed by Sandra Mitchell, the public defender assigned to Peterson's case. She faced an uphill battle. Her client was widely despised in the community. The evidence against him was substantial, but she had a job to do, and she was determined to do it. Her strategy focused on creating doubt, questioning the reliability of evidence collected 18 years after the crime, suggesting alternative theories, emphasizing the lack of direct proof. The prosecution's opening statement was powerful. Thornton walked the jury through the timeline of October 12, 2002. He described Jessica and Amanda Miller, young, vibrant, full of promise. He described their last night alive, the routine walk home they never completed. He described 18 years of a family's anguish. And then he introduced Gerald Peterson, the trusted community member who'd used that trust to commit murder and hide his crimes for nearly 2 decades. The prosecution's case unfolded over 2 weeks of testimony. Forensic scientist Sarah Chun took the stand to explain the gear oil evidence, describing how the specific formulation found on the victim's clothing matched the lubricant used at the Rockcrest quarry where Peterson worked. She brought charts, chemical analyses, distribution records. The connection was clear and scientific. The forensic anthropologist Dr. Hendricks testified about the excavation of the grave, the condition of the remains, and the evidence of blunt force trauma that killed the sisters. She displayed photographs, not of the bodies themselves, but of the skeletal evidence and the location. The jury listened intently, some visibly disturbed by the clinical descriptions of violence. Detective Brennan took the stand and walked through the entire investigation, from the initial disappearance in 2002 through the discovery of the remains in 2020. He explained how Peterson had been interviewed briefly in the original investigation but eliminated based on his wife's alibi. He described the painstaking forensic work that had connected the evidence to Peterson. His testimony lasted an entire day, covering 18 years of investigative work condensed into hours of questions and answers. And then came the testimony that broke the courtroom's composure. Linda Peterson, Gerald's own daughter, took the stand. She described finding her mother's journals, reading the entry from October 12, 2002, realizing her father had lied about his whereabouts that night. She testified about the hair scrunchie and class ring found in her father's garage, items that had no innocent explanation. She cried on the stand, torn between loyalty to her father and the truth she couldn't deny. The prosecution played a recorded interview with Margaret Peterson, conducted by mental health professionals to assess her competency. Despite her dementia, Margaret's memory of the night of October 12, 2002, remained clear. She described Gerald coming home late, covered in dirt, his hands shaking, his clothes immediately thrown away. She described his threat if she didn't provide an alibi. The recorded testimony was devastating in its simple honesty. The blood evidence from Peterson's truck was presented through testimony from the DNA analyst. The analyst explained how luminol works, how blood traces can persist for years, how the DNA profiles match Jessica and Amanda Miller. The defense tried to challenge the evidence, suggesting possible contamination or degradation over time, but the analyst's credentials and the rigorous testing protocols made those challenges seem weak. The defense presented its case over 3 days. Sandra Mitchell called witnesses who testified to Gerald Peterson's character, church members, former co-workers, neighbors who'd known him for decades. They described a kind, helpful man, someone who'd never shown violence, someone who'd been a model citizen. The implication was clear. How could this man have committed such horrendous crimes? The defense challenged the forensic evidence, bringing in their own expert to suggest the gear oil could have transferred through other means, that the blood evidence might be unreliable given the time elapsed, that the journal entry was from a woman whose memory couldn't be trusted. They argued that circumstantial evidence, no matter how compelling, wasn't the same as proof. They emphasized reasonable doubt. The prosecution's rebuttal focused on one key point: the personal items found in Peterson's garage. The defense had no explanation for why Gerald Peterson would possess Amanda Miller's class ring and Jessica's hair scrunchie. None. These weren't items that could have been innocently obtained. They weren't items that could have been transferred accidentally. They were trophies, kept by someone who wanted to remember what he'd done. Closing arguments lasted a full day. District Attorney Thornton methodically walked through every piece of evidence, showing how they all interconnected, how they all pointed to Gerald Peterson. He reminded the jury of Jessica and Amanda Miller, of the lives cut short, of the 18 years their family had suffered without answers. The evidence speaks, he concluded, and it speaks with one voice. Gerald Peterson is guilty. Sandra Mitchell's closing argument emphasized doubt. She asked the jury to consider the magnitude of convicting someone based on circumstantial evidence. She pointed out gaps in the prosecution's timeline. She reminded them that in America, we presume innocence until guilt is proven beyond a reasonable doubt. If you have doubt, she said, you must vote not guilty. The jury began deliberations on April 23, 2021. The waiting began. Patricia and Robert Miller sat in the courthouse lobby, along with dozens of community members and reporters. The hours stretched. 1 day passed, then 2. The longer the jury deliberated, the more anxiety grew. Was there a holdout? Did someone have reasonable doubt? On the afternoon of April 25th, after nearly 30 hours of deliberation, the jury sent word. They'd reached a verdict. The courtroom filled within minutes. Patricia and Robert Miller sat in the front row, holding hands so tightly their fingers were white. Behind them, rows of community members, reporters, and interested observers. Gerald Peterson was brought in, seated beside his attorney, his face expressionless. Judge Martha Reynolds took the bench and asked if the jury had reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor," the jury foreman replied, a 52-year-old insurance adjuster who'd been selected as foreman on the first day of deliberations. "On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Jessica Miller, how do you find?" "We find the defendant, Gerald Peterson, guilty." Patricia Miller gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The courtroom erupted in whispers that Judge Reynolds quickly silenced. She asked the second question. "On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Amanda Miller, how do you find?" "We find the defendant, Gerald Peterson, guilty." Gerald Peterson showed no reaction. He simply stared straight ahead, his face a mask. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but Peterson didn't acknowledge it. Behind him, the courtroom was a mixture of tears, relieved sighs, and quiet satisfaction. After 18 years, a jury had spoken. Gerald Peterson was guilty of murdering Jessica and Amanda Miller. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, allowing time for pre-sentencing investigations and victim impact statements. In Missouri, first-degree murder carries a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The death penalty had been considered but ultimately not pursued by the district attorney's office, partly due to Peterson's age and partly due to the circumstantial nature of the evidence. On June 7, 2021, the courtroom reconvened for sentencing. This time, the focus was on the victims and their family. Judge Reynolds invited victim impact statements, giving those affected by the crimes a chance to speak directly to Peterson and to the court about the impact of his actions. Patricia Miller approached the microphone, her hands shaking but her voice steady. She spoke for 20 minutes, describing the daughters she'd lost, the 18 years of not knowing, the torture of hope followed by the devastation of confirmation. She described holidays without them, birthdays marked by absence, a bedroom kept as a shrine because she couldn't bear to change it. She looked directly at Gerald Peterson and asked a question she knew would never be answered. Why? Why our girls? What did they ever do to you? Peterson didn't look at her. He stared at the table in front of him, his expression unchanged. Robert Miller spoke next, his statement shorter but no less powerful. He described the man he'd become after losing his daughters, consumed by rage, by grief, by the desperate need for answers. He described years of therapy, of medication, of struggling to find a reason to continue living. You didn't just kill my daughters, he told Peterson. You killed a part of me, a part of my wife, a part of this entire community. Other community members spoke. Friends of the sisters, teachers who'd known them, the owner of the Townside Diner where they'd worked. Each described the ripple effects of the murders, how the tragedy had changed Oak Bend from a trusting small town into a place of suspicion and fear, how parents had stopped letting their children walk alone, how the sense of safety had been shattered, how the unsolved mystery had hung over the community like a dark cloud for 18 years. Judge Reynolds asked if Gerald Peterson wished to make a statement. His attorney advised against it, but Peterson stood. For a moment, it seemed like he might finally explain, might finally confess, might finally show some remorse. Instead, he simply said, "I maintain my innocence," and sat back down. Judge Reynolds delivered the sentence with a tone of finality. Gerald Peterson, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence presented at trial demonstrated a calculated betrayal of trust, a heinous crime against 2 innocent young women, and a willful deception maintained for 18 years. This court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on each count, sentences to run consecutively. You will spend the remainder of your natural life in the custody of the Missouri Department of Corrections. 2 consecutive life sentences. Gerald Peterson, 68 years old, would die in prison. As Peterson was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Patricia Miller finally allowed herself to break down completely. Her husband held her as she sobbed, tears of grief for the daughters she'd lost, tears of relief that justice had finally been served, tears of exhaustion from 18 years of fighting for answers. Around them, the courtroom slowly emptied, people processing what they'd witnessed, what it meant for them and for Oak Bend. Outside the courthouse, District Attorney Thornton held a brief press conference. He thanked the investigators, the forensic specialists, the jury, and most of all, he acknowledged the Miller family's 18-year ordeal. This case reminds us that cold cases are never truly cold, he said. As long as there are dedicated investigators, as long as forensic science continues to advance, there is always hope for justice. The conviction of Gerald Peterson sent shockwaves through Oak Bend that continued long after the trial ended. The revelation that a trusted community member, a church deacon, a man who'd helped search for the victims, was actually their murderer forced a collective reckoning with uncomfortable truths. How well do we really know our neighbors? Can evil hide behind a mask of respectability? And how many other cold cases might finally be solved with modern forensic techniques? The Miller case became a catalyst for change in Missouri's approach to cold cases. The success in solving a case that had been dormant for 18 years demonstrated the power of persistent investigation combined with advancing technology. In the months following Peterson's conviction, the Missouri State Highway Patrol announced the formation of a dedicated cold case unit, specifically tasked with reviewing unsolved cases using modern forensic methods. The cold case unit began systematically reviewing files from across the state, prioritizing cases where physical evidence had been preserved. DNA analysis that wasn't available or wasn't affordable in the 1980s and 1990s could now be applied to samples that had been stored in evidence rooms for decades. Trace evidence that had been too small to analyze with older technology could now be examined with sophisticated instruments. The Miller case proved that time didn't erase all evidence. It just required new tools to interpret it. For families of other missing persons across Missouri, the Miller case brought something they'd almost lost: hope. Support groups for families of cold case victims reported increased participation after the Peterson conviction. Parents who'd given up on ever knowing what happened to their children reached out to investigators, asking if their cases could be reviewed. The message was clear: if the Miller case could be solved after 18 years, maybe others could be too. Oak Bend itself went through a painful period of reflection and healing. The Oak Bend Methodist Church held multiple community forums to process the betrayal of trust that Peterson represented. Pastor Coleman addressed the difficult question of how someone could participate in church life, speak about morality and faith, while hiding such monstrous crimes. Evil doesn't always announce itself, he told the congregation. Sometimes it wears the most convincing disguises. The corner of Main Street and Oak Avenue, where Jessica's cell phone had been found 18 years earlier, became an official memorial site. The town council approved the installation of a small park with 2 benches and a plaque commemorating Jessica and Amanda Miller. It became a place where community members could sit, remember, and reflect on the fragility of safety and the importance of community vigilance. The case also prompted reviews of how alibis are verified and documented in investigations. The fact that Margaret Peterson's false alibi had eliminated her husband from serious consideration in 2002 highlighted the need for more thorough corroboration. Law enforcement agencies across Missouri began implementing more rigorous procedures for alibi verification, especially from family members who might be influenced by fear or loyalty. The gear oil evidence that had been crucial to solving the case led to broader discussion about trace evidence databases. Forensic scientists advocated for creating searchable databases of industrial chemicals, specialized materials, and unique substances that could help investigators narrow down suspects in future cases. The specific formulation of MILGO 470 had been the key, but that key only worked because investigators could trace its limited distribution and specialized applications. Patricia and Robert Miller, though forever marked by their loss, found a purpose in the aftermath of the trial. They became advocates for families of missing persons, working with organizations that provide support and resources. Patricia began speaking at conferences about the importance of never giving up on cold cases, about maintaining pressure on investigators, about the advances in forensic science that make solving old cases possible. Robert finally allowed himself to change the girls' bedroom, boxing up their belongings not as a way of forgetting but as a way of moving forward. He donated Jessica's softball equipment to the Oak Bend Youth League and Amanda's art supplies to the high school art program. It was a way of keeping their memory alive while acknowledging that life, however painful, does continue. Legal scholars studied the Miller case as an example of successful cold case prosecution. The reliance on circumstantial evidence, the use of technological advances, the importance of persistence, these became teaching points in law schools and police academies. The case demonstrated that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied, that advances in science can give voice to victims who've been silent for decades. The Miller case also prompted discussions about the death penalty. Peterson's age and the circumstantial nature of the evidence had influenced the decision not to seek capital punishment. But some victims' advocates argued that the heinous nature of the crimes and the years of deception warranted the harshest possible sentence. The debate continued in legal circles, with the Miller case cited by both sides. By 2022, Oak Bend had begun to heal, though the scars remained. The annual vigil for Jessica and Amanda, previously held every October 12th, was transformed into a broader cold case awareness day that honored all victims of unsolved crimes. The Townside Diner, under new ownership, hosted a community breakfast that day with proceeds going to cold case investigation funds. Detective Marcus Brennan, now in his 70s and fully retired, still kept a copy of the case file at home. He'd spent 18 years of his career working on the Miller case, and its resolution represented the pinnacle of his professional life. He occasionally spoke to law enforcement groups about persistence, about never dismissing seemingly small pieces of evidence, about trusting advances in technology even when the trail seems cold. The Miller case stands as testament to several principles: that evil can hide in plain sight, that justice has no statute of limitations, that forensic science continues to evolve and give voice to the voiceless, and that communities have the capacity to heal even from the deepest wounds. Jessica and Amanda Miller's legacy became not just the tragedy of their deaths, but the hope their case brought to others still seeking answers. As I bring this story to a close, I want you to consider what the Miller case really represents. On one level, it's a true crime story, a mystery, an investigation, a trial, a conviction. But on a deeper level, it's a story about the persistence of truth, even when truth seems impossible to find. Jessica and Amanda Miller walked out of the Townside Diner on October 12, 2002, looking forward to apple pie at home, planning their futures, living their ordinary lives. In the span of just a few minutes, those lives were stolen by someone they had no reason to fear. For 18 years, they lay in an unmarked grave while their killer lived freely, pretending to be something he wasn't, deceiving everyone who knew him. But here's what's important to remember. The truth didn't die with Jessica and Amanda. It waited. It persisted in tiny traces of industrial gear oil, in blood that luminol could still detect after nearly 2 decades, in journal entries written by a frightened woman documenting her husband's lies. The truth waited for technology to catch up, for investigators to connect dots that couldn't be connected in 2002, for someone brave enough to come forward with evidence. This cold case, like so many others that have been solved years or even decades after the crimes occurred, proves that time doesn't erase evidence. It just requires patience and advancing science to interpret it. Every cold case represents a family still waiting for answers, a community still seeking closure, and very often, a killer who thinks they've gotten away with their crimes. The advancement of forensic science has been remarkable. DNA analysis that took weeks in 2002 can now be completed in days. Databases that didn't exist 20 years ago can now connect evidence across state lines, across decades. Techniques like advanced luminol testing, chemical trace analysis, and digital forensic recovery have transformed what's possible in criminal investigation. Cases that were genuinely unsolvable in the past are now being cracked open with tools that previous generations of investigators could only dream about. For Patricia and Robert Miller, the conviction of Gerald Peterson didn't bring their daughters back. Nothing could do that, but it did bring something they'd been denied for 18 years. Answers. They finally knew what had happened, who was responsible, and they saw that person held accountable. In the aftermath of unimaginable tragedy, that knowledge, however painful, provided a foundation for beginning to heal. If you're listening to this and you have information about any cold case, any unsolved crime, any missing person, please come forward. Your tip might seem insignificant to you, but it could be the piece investigators need to solve a case that's been frozen for years. You could be the person who gives a family the answers they've been desperately seeking. You could be the person who ensures a killer doesn't remain free. The Miller case was solved because someone, Linda Peterson, found the courage to come forward with evidence that implicated her own father. That couldn't have been easy. The loyalty to family runs deep, but the loyalty to truth and justice ran deeper. If she hadn't made that choice, Gerald Peterson might have died peacefully in his sleep, his crimes never exposed, the Miller family never receiving closure. This case also reminds us to question our assumptions about trust and safety. We want to believe that pillars of the community, church leaders, friendly neighbors, we want to believe these people are exactly what they appear to be. Usually they are. But sometimes, as the Miller case demonstrated, evil hides behind the most convincing masks. It's not about becoming paranoid or distrusting everyone. It's about maintaining appropriate awareness, about teaching our children that danger doesn't always look dangerous. As forensic science continues to advance, we can expect more cold cases to be solved. Investigators across the country are reviewing evidence from decades-old cases, applying new techniques, finding answers that seemed impossible just a few years ago. Every solved cold case brings closure to a family, removes a killer from society or holds them accountable, and sends a message: you cannot hide forever. Jessica and Amanda Miller were 19 years old when they died. They should have had full lives ahead of them: careers, relationships, children, dreams fulfilled. Gerald Peterson stole all of that, but he couldn't steal their memory, and he couldn't prevent the truth from eventually emerging. Their case became a symbol of persistence, of hope, of the power of modern investigation to right old wrongs. This cold case, solved after 18 years, shocked a community when the arrest finally came. But it also demonstrated something profoundly important. Justice may be delayed, but it doesn't have to be denied. Every cold case has the potential to be solved. Every missing person deserves the efforts of dedicated investigators. And every family deserves the truth, no matter how long it takes to find it. Thank you for listening to this story about the Missouri 2002 cold case that finally got solved in 2020. Remember Jessica and Amanda Miller, two young women whose lives mattered, whose deaths demanded justice, and whose case became a beacon of hope for other families still seeking answers. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it inspired you to support cold case investigations or victim advocacy, that's their legacy living on. Until next time, stay aware, stay safe, and remember, no case is ever truly cold. Thanks for listening.